Chapter 14. Freytag first, and then Chalcedony. So it was that the nomad hens found new quarters for themselves in the hemlock by the waterfall, easily roosting in its branches and glad to have cover before the winter began. Its boughs hung down like a thatched roof, mildly silver underneath its needles. Its trunk went up like a mast, and it stood at the south face of a stone cliff which broke the cold of the northern wind. Nearby, the water plunged over that same cliff, sometimes misting their tree, but the mist had become ice in the morning, roofing them, and the everlasting thunder caused them to roost closer together for the talk. They felt very private and warm inside their tower. They could have lived that way forever, except that the rooster himself had grown as gray and cold as the weather, and there was not a hen among them who could not be affected by his mood, nor a mouse, nor a weasel, for that matter. Chanteclair brooded. He'd become fiercely introspective since the move, forcing the hens to wonder whether the hemlock was wrong after all, and individually they checked their own recent behavior for some offense against him. But Chanteclair had never been silent about offenses, so they were confused. He did not strut among them these days. He stood apart the day long, staring at the ground, and sometimes he'd fix his eye upon one chicken, flustering her altogether, until she'd scoot away a step or two and find that he was staring at the place where she had been, not at her, and then she felt peculiar, invisible. It was a penetrating eye in his head, but it seemed to see nothing, like a sculpture. "Lady, he's ailing," said Jasper. "He is," said Pertolote. "I don't know why." "Maybe you could slip some medicinal into him." "It's not his body, Jasper, not his body. It's his mind." "Well," mused the lardier bird, "forgive me the rudeness," she said, "maybe a romp in the woods, just you and him alone?" "Jasper, I said forgiving me." "But I said it's his mind, right? He has no eyes for me these days, nor desires either." Chanteclair brooded, as if thinking were a whirlpool, a furious sucking of all his attentions. The rooster stood apart and lost himself in deep, deep frowning. In the morning his lauds sounded like sleet, waking the hens with a miserable chilliness, unlike the sunny praise that they were used to. So then it was a question which gray was the cause and which the effect. Did the iron-gray sky cause that crow, or did the sullen gray rooster cause the sky? Nobody asked the question aloud. Terce and sext and nun were spikes, stabbing the hens in their labors. They bent to their work and thought, "Why is he so angry with us?" The canonical crows had never been used for punishments before. And the vespers he crowed was a mere "Quit!" and Compline dumped them to sleep, castaways. This clock of his grew cold and careless until it simply banged them through their days, and they simply obeyed. No longer did Chanteclair interpret their moments and their experiences to them, nor did he recollect the past to weave it into the present, nor did he call them unto a hopeful future. But that's what his canon used to accomplish. He used to, by praising them or fussing at them, assure them of importance. And because he did it with such variety and skill, that rooster could crow an arabesque. On the other hand, he could crow plain puritanical proverbs in single syllables. He was the glory in their homely lives. When they were moved to wonder about their value or the worth or the pageantry or the grandeur or the simple logic of their common existence, why, they looked to the rooster, that golden cock. More specifically, they heard the message implicit in his regular crows, and their wondering was straightway laid to rest. It didn't even become a question. They were content. But lately the canonical crows had grown empty. So much sounding brass, always at the right time precisely, but always perfunctory, always hollow. How could a hen not be affected by the change? Yea, though not a single duty of his was neglected, and none could charge the rooster with malfeasance in his office. He was so righteous. They felt so confused. He hadn't avoided any obligations, and yet they felt altogether avoided. Chanteclair brooded, and the world indeed turned grey. But the brothers mice loved him, and they believed always in the possibility of healing. Moreover, they had an absolute faith in pats on the back and smiles and nods and tiny salutes and humor. And where their rooster was concerned, they'd never felt the least hesitation or fear. "It's his mind," the dear Lady Pertelote had said. His mind? Well, then, the brothers mice determined among themselves to soothe the rooster's mind, and they chose Freytag, for his obvious talents, to be their point man, as it were. Thus it was, one colourless afternoon, that as Chanteclair paced south along the Liverbrook, with his wings back and his head bent down to the ground, he developed a double, a tiny self behind himself. Here came Freytag, hopping like a bird on two legs, his head bent down, his forepaws clasped behind his back, and his little face drawn into the most frightful frown. The big cock moved, the little one moved. "Hum," said Freytag, suffering heavy melancholia. "Hum, hum, hum." Suddenly 6 more mice sprang out of the ground in front of Chanteclair. They sat themselves into a perfect line and immediately began to clap. The rooster drew up his head and stopped. "Look!" they cried, pointing behind him, and he turned and blinked at Freytag. They clapped like the perfect audience, and then they said, "Watch! Sit down and watch!" Then they fell silent, smiling, and Freytag commenced to act. "Heh," said the mouse. This was a sigh. He mopped his face with a dainty paw. He rolled his eyes to the skies above and spoke. "Oh, 'tis a monumental sad thing to be alive," he sighed. And then he prayed earnestly, if only a body could walk the world another way than to be alive. Hey, and hey, oh, mercy me! Freytag bent beneath the burden and delivered a truly tragic moan. That mouse moaned for a fully sustained 30 seconds, by the end of which there wasn't a scrap of air in his tiny body, and he looked like crushed misery. "Hurrah!" cried 6 mice in a line, breaking into applause. "You've got him, brother! Watch, Rooster, watch! No one can imitate like Freytag!" Now Freytag sat on his haunches and began to pump his little head up and down. In perfect solemnity he spun both forepaws like propellers. He pinched his mouth. Wodenstag leaped up and gestured. "A rooster," he announced, "about to crow!" And then he rushed back to his seat. Still spinning his paws, still pumping his head, Freytag cried, "Stop, son!" Amazing, he managed a waddle under his chin. "Halt, moon! Don't none of you clouds go potty now. Listen to me, and I'll tell you the time of day, because how would you know without me?" Imperious was the squeak of that command. "How could you live without me?" Just then it seemed to the mice that Chanteclair had allowed a little grin at the corner of his beak. Well, that's what they were looking for, and that just shattered their restraint. They giggled and giggled with helpless delight, because the rooster would love it. Chanteclair would love what Freytag could do. Wodenstag cried, "Go!" And Freytag's neck shot out an inch, and Freytag's eyes squeezed shut, and the whirling paws pushed down like wings, and the whole body rose impossibly on 2 hind legs, and Freytag's mouth stretched to prodigious proportions, and Freytag crowed. "Kicky-kee, diddle-dee-dee, me I make up the laws for ye, and here's the main one to kicky your bum. Shut up and leave me a be!" Oh, what a crow, straight from the good old days. The poor brothers simply collapsed, laughing and beating each other on the back, howling till tears came to their eyes, and they were reduced to the blowing and the beeping of their noses. Oh, they sobbed. Oh, dear Rooster, isn't it? But Chanteclair turned on his heel. With neither a word, nor a grin, nor a compliment, nor the ghost of caring, he walked away from them. The laughter was murdered in their very throats, and the mice felt sudden embarrassment to be lying all over the ground in such contorted attitudes. But Freytag, little Freytag, the second youngest of the brothers, blessed with a special talent and cursed by it, Freytag fought with all his might to keep his lower lip from trembling. Yet even before the rooster had paced around the first bend out of sight, Freytag failed. Chanteclair brooded. How could the animals not be troubled? They were thrown, as it were, upon their own devices. There's freedom in that, of course, but it could also cause disharmony when one device hinders another. They were permitted the enlargement, each of her own character, but that also allowed the enlargements of the faults within those characters. And a certain self-centeredness could be justified when the prevailing law is every hen for herself. Jasper wasn't an evil hen. Truly, she was just big, which is no wickedness. But bigness causes appetites, and appetites cause carelessness. Likewise, Chalcedony was not useless among the hens. Neither was she despised. Truly, she was just crippled. She had a claw that wanted always to ball up, like a spider dying, and therefore she was slow to scratch seed, late in eating it, and the thinnest chicken of all. For most of their lives, these two had maintained a workable friendship in spite of their differences, because the rooster had a discerning eye, and had divided goods according to need, not according to appetite. But the rooster was brooding these days, and blind. So what? So natural tendencies went unrestrained. So plain hennish nature became a problem. And so what? So here came Jasper at a charging speed, all healthy in bulk, wheezing single-mindedly, her eye upon an open seed. Chalcedony's. And there went Chalcedony spinning sideways from the bump of Jasper's body, and before she could cry out, there went the seed down Jasper's gullet. So fat grew fatter, while thin was forced to fast. This was a serious affliction for Chalcedony. She grew more anemic than ever before, and her eyes seemed larger in her head because of the waste of flesh, and she was tired, too tired to argue. "Please don't do that," she'd say to Jasper, and she'd repeat wanly, "Please." And Jasper would answer with tons of apology, because the Jasper satisfied was altogether different from the Jasper hungry. "So sorry, so sorry. Can you ever forgive me? I don't know what's come over me these days. I can't help myself. You want to know the truth? The truth is, I didn't even see you standing by that tidbit. Terribly, terribly sorry, little Chalcedony. Forgive me, okay? I won't do it again." But she did it again. The Jasper satisfied always reverted to the Jasper hungry. She did it habitually. She wasn't evil, just big. But big was getting bigger all the time, and thin was getting tired. So Chalcedony broke a promise she had made to beautiful Pertolote, never to wander away alone. During the daylight hours, she wandered farther and farther from the animals at the hemlock tree. She pecked a little food wherever she went, eating slowly and carefully, trying to remind herself that she should be hungry, and now that she could, she must eat. The conviction itself was dwindling within her. On the other hand, daydreams flourished inside of her, for the more she went alone, the higher her private fancy flew, until it was nearly a rapture. And what did the hen imagine for herself? Well, she'd be ashamed for any in the all world to know it, but 'twas to be a lady, a fine aristocrat of the most exquisite manners, breeding, dress, and dishes, a lady eating delectables, a pampered lady feeding on dainty bits, and beautiful, a lady. In her dreams, she ate very well. In reality, however, it was the autumn, and late in the season, and the trees stood shivering beneath a low gray sky with not a leaf to cover them. And the rooster was distracted in his soul, and Sister Jasper troubled her existence. and Chalcedony hardly ate it all. She fed on the air of her fantasies, and she wasted. And then one day she wandered numbly into a valley north of the hemlock, all unconscious of her surrounding, until her claw crunched on something and woke her. She looked down. With a start she looked up and around and discovered the valley to be crowded with a host of tiny bodies, all of them dead and still and weirdly silent. "Oh no," she whispered. They were cicada husks. The ground, the rocks, the bark, and every rough surface was studded with the dried skins of 10,000 cicadas, each one split at the back, each one gripping its position with brittle legs and wide, transparent eyes. A valley of bones, thought Chalcedony, and the silence frightened her. All at once she imagined that she stood in the theater of a terrible war, where there had been whirring wings and strafing hordes of attacking warriors, horrible slaughters, screams and the death rattle. Past now, past and silent, and nothing left but the field, the hollow clutter of the dead, and she to walk among them. Little Chalcedony swallowed. She made her own noise. "Hello?" she peeped in a tiny voice. "Who?" she called. "Is somebody there?" Nobody answered. None of the skeletons budged. 10,000 vizards frowned around her, all of them empty. She said, "Hee hee." That was a giggle, meant for herself, and since no one challenged her, she scolded herself more loudly. "Oh, lady, don't you know," she said, "they fly, cicadas. They don't fight. It's in their nature to leave their skins behind. But so many," she whispered, staring, "so many." It was the 7th year, after all, the traditional date of cicadic migration, and though she'd never seen the wonder herself, she'd heard stories of the daytime sky gone dark as midnight, filled with the clouds of living bodies, ticking and whirring from one horizon to the other, the year of Jubilee. They'd flown to a farther refuge. Chalcedony the hen put forth her beak and pecked one of the husks. It cracked and fell to the ground, leaving 6 good limbs behind. Well, that was easy. She plucked one, and as soon as the calcium stuck to her tongue, this is what she did. She ate it. It crunched. It tasted gamey, salty. It chewed down to a sticky morsel, but it satisfied the gizzard in her. And the thin hen giggled. "Well," she said, hardly allowing her next thought to be true. "Well, well!" She ate a second, and then a third, and soon that hen was gobbling husks and laughing at once, stuffing herself, until contentment crept upon her, despite her troubled life, and the next thought proved itself to be true after all. This valley was hers, her own possession, and it was full of 10,000 dinners. What a day for Chalcedony! In that moment, a marvel occurred for the little hen. Her dream came true. As proud and picky as any lady ever was, she began to mince among the skeletons. "Too tiny," she declared, with a sweep of her tail, rejecting a husk. Whenever had Chalcedony rejected anything? "No, sir, you're too tiny for the likes of me. I take the best, thanking you." And la-di-da, she scoffed, so hintsy. "La-di-da, no, never, nothing but the best for Dame Chalcedony." It was a glorious afternoon in the life of this hen. Fullness, finally, made her free, and she could almost think herself to be pretty, at the very least refined. Oh, she sashayed her tail feathers left and right, and she walked sublimely on her bald claw, making little of the limp. And then, in a whisper as devout as any prayer, in gratitude at the evening of that day, she asked, "Why mayn't Chalcedony eat as well as another?" And she answered herself with a sigh, "Well, she may, she may." With dusk came the ending, but how could she bear to let it end? "Snacks," said Chalcedony in her kingdom. "Wouldn't a lady want snacks at midnight, and wouldn't she deserve them, if in that she had them? Well, think on that a moment." She thought on that, deeply, though she was aware of the danger that Jasper might see and seize any new food around. Yet she had grown bold today. Therefore, "Yes," she said. "Chalcedony's answer is yes." A delightful answer it was, too, tickling her down to the abdomen. So, then, but how to keep snacks to herself and herself alone? Ah, there's a puzzle, surely. In darkness, little Chalcedony crept back to the hemlock, arriving just when others were settling on their roosts. There swelled a monstrous bulge below her left wing. There was a dreadful poverty written all over her face. Poor, poor Chalcedony. But there were giggles slipping from her beak. Jasper, dull to variations in the spirits of other hens, didn't notice. Neither did Chanteclair the Rooster notice, that spectral lord whose passing was a chilly thing. Pertolote alone came near Chalcedony, asking in private, "Is something the matter?" "No, ma'am," she said. Then shrewdly she bethought herself and cried, "Yes, yes, ma'am, that is no more nor usual. Life." "But you're limping worse than yesterday," said Pertolote. "Oh, that is such a true statement you made." Chalcedony frowned as solemnly as she could. Pertolote cocked a suspicious eye at her. "And you're making strange noises in your nostril," she said. "Burps, my lady," said Chalcedony so sadly. "Burps." Chapter 15. Home and the First Watch of the Night. In Farik's mind, the prospect of babies and the panoramic emptiness before him were equally foreboding. Either would confuse the rules of life as he understood them. Both threatened experiences totally foreign to him, since he knew near nothing of either one. Both would strip him bare naked, one in the daylight down to his pitiful bones, and the other, by harsh responsibilities, down to his pitiful, no-account, worthless, craven, and unable self. Both, therefore, caused the poor coyote to blink. Merely to blink and to lay his chin flat on the ground. Well, he would have turned tail and retreated from either one, except that he hadn't the slightest idea of how somebody retreated from the onset of babies. And so far as the wasteland in front of him was concerned, Rachel kept walking into it. He had to watch over Rachel in her rashness. She was his wife. Through baleful eyes, therefore, he watched Rachel. But he did not follow. That woman, casting constant glances of delight in Farik's direction, none of which he acknowledged, that woman, humming to herself some silly music in her nose as though she were actually happy or content or something, that woman went forth and trotted the plains with an easy bicycling rhythm, flipping her paws all fearlessly, while on Farik the only thing that moved was his eyeballs. She took the measure of the hidden canyon, pacing it from its northern to its southern ends. Half-mile she went, while Farik's eyeballs rolled a half-inch, and his nostrils blew a sigh. She kept looking down, tipping toward deeper spaces. She'd take a cautious step, and then scramble back again. And always she'd glance toward Farik, but never did he show a bit of tooth, not a smile or the least encouragement from Farik. Neither would he show anxiety. Oh no, this was her choice altogether. She knew where he stood on the matter. He sighed. He wondered to himself if he screamed, "Fire!" would that woman answer just a minute? Farik sighed with the force of a blast, but only his eyeballs moved. Then Rachel nodded, as though making a decision. She turned and came the 60 yards toward him, bringing her happiness and so forth, her smiles and her humming and so forth. And did he respond? Humph. On the other hand, did his clear disgruntlement fret her any? No, not a whit. Not a cloud in her sunshine. Humph! What Rachel did, she lay down beside him, smiling. She stroked his frosty snout with her muzzle, and then the next thing was that she kissed him. And did he respond? No, he had more convictions than that. But did she fret? No. In the sweetest, most ingenuous of voices, she said, "Excuse me," and she asked, "Are you busy?" Farik blinked twice, but Farik, grim-fixed, did not respond. She began to pluck at his whiskers. "Just tell me if you're busy, Farik," she said with a downcast, soft humility. "I really don't mean to bother you if you are." His eyeballs slid back and forth. He lifted his lip a minimal degree and hissed, "Yes," between his teeth. Poor fellow, he'd responded. "See, that's exactly what I thought," said Rachel brightly. She stood up, taking her warmth away from him. "Well, you stay here and finish your business. We both have jobs. Probably yours is more important. But I have to find a way down into the canyon, though I haven't seen one yet. Tell you what, I'll go and look alone, okay? Because you're busy, I mean. And I'll test whatever I find, and if I fall, I'll call you, okay?" She began to trot away, briskly. Business and efficiency. "I'll probably scream," she said. "Scream?" Farik's eyes popped wide open and his ears sprang up. "Scream?" Then he narrowed his eyelids down to concentrated darts and troubled himself to think very hard. Surely she wouldn't. Of course the woman would not. No one could. Rachel had more sense than to... Yet there went that healthy bush of a tail gladly across an alien plane, and he knew, Farik just knew, that the front end of that woman was still grinning. In the end, it was Farik who found their home for them. Yes, and they denned in the canyon after all. But it wasn't altogether Rachel's coyness that persuaded her husband onto the naked plains, nor any romantic foolery that sent him headlong down a gorge. That sort of recklessness simply was not in Farik's character, because he really believed in the dangers. He really was a frightened coyote, and could not be tricked from his fears. No, in Farik's case, it was only perfect fear that cast out fear, one with a greater torment than the other. And on that particular day, one wolf in the forest was a more convincing argument than Rachel's grin, and a more certain torment than all the strangeness of the plains. Farik knew what a wolf could do. Before Rachel had trotted 20 yards, Farik felt shocks that couldn't have come of her light body. Shocks. The ground pulsed. A drumming shuddered at his paws, a rhythm from eastward directions. Now Farik's fears had sharpened his senses to a nearly caustic point, and he knew what he felt, precisely as though he'd seen it. Wolf's paw, patting the earth. Shocks. Wolf's prowl. Next he caught a scent on the breezes, and Farik could even name the name. There was coming a wolf, in slow lope, through the forest, white-faced, white eyes, a winter wolf, with shoulders rolling and as strong as timber, yellow teeth, a low nose, and a name of the north, Boreas. Zoom! Farik was shooting across the plain in serious alarm. He passed Rachel, hissing, "Fire!" "What?" she said. "Good God! The woman said what?" He described a huge circle on the plain, returned to her, and hissed, "It's Boreas of the forest! For God's sake, run!" And on he streaked toward this canyon. She was right. The gorge was there. He met it at its northern end. Without a pause, he hurdled the cliff and descended. This wasn't suicidal. Farik's eyes, so quickened by fear, saw in an instant a fall of stones like stair-steps going 30 feet down, and his paws brushed those stones. To his right the water burst out of rock. To his left it flowed away between high walls. He hit bottom and spun around, all in a single motion. Next to the stone staircase, set low in the cliff, was a small cavern, a little cave. "Refuge!" he thought. He bolted up the stairs again. "Rachel!" he cried. She was trotting, smiling. "Oh, Rachel!" he pleaded. Her pace seemed never to vary, nor her mood either. "Woman!" Down he dropped again, praying Rachel behind him. Around he whipped on the canyon floor, and, like the swallow into her chimney, he popped in the cavern and froze. So then here came Rachel, picking her woman's way down these giant steps, congratulating him on his sharp eyes, though she said she knew he could find the way to the bottom once he put his mind to it, chattering. And when, at the bottom, she saw the little cave, plugged with coyote butt, she broke into yips of pure delight. "Tssst!" warned Farik. "Tssst! You found it!" Rachel could not contain her gratitude. "Oh, Farik, I love you! No one could ask for a better home for the children. No one could have a kinder husband than you." That's how they came to den in the canyon. But then, in the following weeks, the weather changed, and Rachel, too, who had never changed before, changed. And Farik had a whole new riddle set before him in the person of his wife. For her changes seemed to have nothing whatever to do with the weathers, and he was confounded. Winter commenced. 2 days after they had gone about scenting a little territory for their own, the winter began with weird, inexplicable shifts, a sort of colliding of the elements, so that Farik Coyote grew wary. He paced constantly. He started at little noises. He rolled his eyes restlessly. And he felt silly, since Rachel did none of these things. But he couldn't help himself. Look, through several days together, the winter would oppress them with humidity and a steady drizzle, would so laden the air that a beast could see his own breath, yet he would sweat in the closeness, and pace. But then in any given night, the cold would hit like a fist, sudden, absolute, and numbing, and the moisture froze so fast 'twould seem as with a click, and the north wind might scream across the land, or else the wind would kill by the cold alone, lazily touching all things to ice. Nobody hung his tail outside the den on such nights, and by morning the muddy world was transfigured. Farik climbed the stones to find the plains pure sheets of ice, slippery under his paws, the sun blinding him by slanting from its surface, the air crisping his whiskers and stabbing zero to his lungs. He'd gulp and suffocate, and the great pine trees he found cased in ice, sparkling, tinkling lightly, and yet splitting the limbs by its weight, causing tremendous crashes in the forest. Little Farik gazed, then, on a cold Eisreisenwelt, so lovely and so sepulchral. Who wouldn't pace nervously at such a spell? Who wouldn't feel tiny between the seasons? Yet tomorrow, or 3 days later, when a coyote had begun to adjust to killing temperatures, a thunderstorm might come stumbling up from the south. Yellow, ireful skies, a stupid, lumbering thunder, totally out of its time and place, yet bellowing round and spouting as though offended by some indignity. By ice? Certainly ice was abolished under this gigantic, untimely displeasure and spit, and then the mud was back. This was no winter like any Farik remembered. The spheres themselves seemed hateful of one another, battling for dominion. And the coyote reacted in kind, skittering up and down the stones, batted back and forth by the cold and the clamor and the irrational lightning. But Rachel? Why, Rachel seemed oblivious of convulsions in the heavens, detached from the world itself, from reality. So that next to her, Farik's jumpiness seemed merely neurotic. Look! There could be the crack of thunder, the rattle and the boom of thunder right above them, and Rachel might sink suddenly inside herself in spite of it. That red coyote might melt into internal meditations, allowing a smile to curl at her lip, and distance to glaze her eye, and she would hum. Hum! No tune, simply a sort of purr at the end of every breath, and contentment. But the first drops of the storm would be splotting her skull. "Rachel!" Farik would try to waken her. He truly worried over her lapse. Strange days, but a stranger wife. Because look, sometimes the woman would rise up laughing, a laughter so hearty that the tears would run from her eyes, damping the fur of her cheeks. And Farik would stare about to find the joke, and, finding nothing funny in all this wintry world, would desperately try to comfort her, to console her hilarity. Well, it seemed manic. Then what did he get for his efforts? Nuzzling. Nuzzlings and kisses and affections in unreasonable quantities. Or else, again, for no reason that the poor coyote could discern, she would suddenly sob. It didn't matter where they were. They might be walking the creek of their canyon, that one water which never froze, when all at once she'd bow her narrow head, and pause and weep as though her heart would break. Poor Farik! Now he would nuzzle her, and he would mutter how that everything was all right, though he was convinced it was all wrong, and he'd there her, and he'd why are you crying her, neither expecting nor receiving an answer. He would feel a clumsy, ignorant fool beside the woman, a perfect stranger, because why was she crying anyway? Did she hurt? Had he done something wrong? Who was this Rachel anyways these days? Skinny Farik felt a constant turmoil in his stomach, which is the way that he worried, and he showed his teeth in stretching his cheeks. The weather and the woman at once, but neither one the cause of the other's distress, and Farik was caught between. Didn't they have a den now? He liked the den, didn't she? Couldn't they brave the winter together? Or what? Or what? One evening, after another such perplexing rain of her tears, Farik screwed up his courage and faced his wife and fixed her with a probing eye, in order to imply how serious his question was about to be, and he said, That's how he began. Conversations, too, could be a danger. Said Farik Coyote, gazing at Rachel, the two of them standing belly-deep in running water between the cliff walls. And then with much more force, Rachel! And he nearly shouted at her, Want to talk about it? About what? She smiled. She was back to smiling so quickly. I don't know, shouted poor Farik. Something's in you. He roared. He tried to grin. It didn't work. He abandoned grinning. She, on the other hand, brightened into the sunniest of smiles. Why, Farik! She giggled. Behold how she'd swung from weeping to laughter in no more than 2 minutes' time. Farik, there is something in me, she giggled. And then her face grew thoughtful. And I have talked about it, she said. Her slant eyes slid from his countenance to deeps he didn't recognize. I've a friend, she said. I've found a friend at the far end of the canyon. I've spoken with her, and she listens, though she has never spoken to me. There's a tragedy in her eye, and her wings are too crippled ever to fly, and she has no tongue, Farik, no tongue in her beak. A plain brown bird, whose name I do not know, because she cannot tell me. Jug, she says, Jug, so sadly, and Teru. Well, Rachel drew her sight back to Farik's face, Farik Coyote's wounded face, and she smiled. Well, I visit her, and I talk, and I feel so much better now. She kissed him. Thank you, she said, and she trotted downstream, leaving him alone. Alone. Forsaken even. His narrow mouth hung open. His wife had a friend he didn't know about? She has a private life? Someone else comforts Rachel? Worse, she gives her sympathies to someone else? Is this why Farik couldn't account for all her changes? Ah. Yes. He abandoned grinning. He went straight to the frown, did Farik Coyote, but not for anger, rather for resignation. He watched her tail snake the water, southward to her friend, and he knew the truth. He was the least of all God's creatures on the earth, ever and ever afraid. It was right for his wife to seek her consolations elsewhere. It felt sad to him, but It was both right and to be expected. No, Farik wouldn't stand in her way. He lowered his head and waded slowly back to the den, dumbstruck at how quickly a whole life might turn around, and all he'd wanted to do was comfort her, and here he was wondering if he should hang around for tomorrow. "I've found a friend." It rapped in the poor coyote's mind like a verdict. But why shouldn't she? He himself couldn't make friends, but that was his way, after all, his fault, his weakness, not hers. He'd never thought before that his weakness might be hindering her. So who was it that made her cry these days? Who else? It was her nature to be a happy coyote, smiling and so forth, humming. Of course she should have friends. So, thought Farik, sticking his snout into their den, maybe he should go away. Because what did he have to recommend himself to her? He kept forgetting, in her presence, that he had nothing at all. Yes, thought Farik, he would go away. And that's the reason why he curled round and round himself in the den, making a donut of his tail, his nose in the middle of it. He sighed. He closed his eyes and fell asleep. Tomorrow. Farik! In the middle of that same night, now whistling with the wind, Rachel woke him, hissing, "Farik! Farik, come here and touch me!" Blinking, instantly tense, he crept to her side in the darkness. "Here," she whispered, below the weather, and she drew his cheek down to her belly, pressing him against the soft nipples there, bare flesh. 100 feelings rushed through the poor coyote all at once. He was so embarrassed by Nipples. He choked with pity for Rachel, whose midnight actions were more irrational than ever. Why would she mash his face into her belly? He felt pain, true pain, thinking he had no right to this intimacy, on account of it was all his fault anyway, and he was about to repair the damage by leaving tomorrow, but here she was being so familiar that how could he leave? And then there was this. Her belly reared back and punched him in the ear. Straight away, one coyote was freezing in the doorway of the den, glaring at the tummy of the other, while the other was trying with all her might not to laugh. "Rachel!" Farik stuttered. "Company! You've got company in there!" Well, that was a pure hilarity to her way of thinking, and she lost control. Rachel collapsed and laughed like a glorious fountain, kicked and rolled and called his name. His ears shot up in bewilderment, and his poor heart was utterly helpless to understand proceedings any more. "Farik, Farik," she sang at the top of her laughter, louder than the wind. "You don't know how much I love you, Farik." She came forward. She took his jowl between her teeth and drew him to herself, and coaxed his head down again, down upon her soft and swelling nipples, down upon the finest fur, the smoothest skin, and she stroked the stiffness in him. "It was your child, Farik," she said. "Oh, my Farik, who takes such good care of me. It was my gift to you that you felt, and I'll give it to you yet, sooner than you know. I'll lay them here before you, and I'll name them one by one, and you won't be afraid of them then, for they shall be beautiful. Farik, I have just one wish for you." Whistles the wind, whistles the winter wind, but Farik only had ears for the sweet absolution of his wife. "Oh, my solemn husband," she whispered, "I wish that one day you will learn to laugh." Well, that was a good night after all. He was still the scared coyote, small below tumultuous elements, but before the morning he admitted that nipples were nice for lying on, and homes were not bad to have, and wives may not be strangers even if they can't be understood, and once in a while it is possible for a pitiful, no-account, worthless rust coyote to cease his agonizing, to lie down, and to feel safe. He didn't leave in the morning, after all.